Most Americans who visit Australia expect the big differences to hit them first. The accent, the beaches, the wildlife, the enormous distances. Maybe even the fact that Australians casually talk about dangerous animals as if they're discussing the weather. But that's not what surprises them most. The real culture shock starts with the tiny things. A person walks into a supermarket and notices something that feels slightly different. They wait at a pedestrian crossing and notice something else. They walk into a cafe, hear the way strangers talk to each other, see how people spend their weekends, and suddenly Australia starts feeling less like a distant English-speaking country and more like a completely different version of normal. And here's the strange part. Most Australians don't even notice they're doing these things. They're just living. But to an American seeing them for the first time, some of these ordinary habits can be surprisingly confusing. So today, we're looking at 10 things Americans visiting Australia tend to notice almost immediately. And the first one is so ordinary that Australians might not even understand why an American would find it interesting. The supermarket experience feels different. An American walks into an Australian supermarket expecting something familiar. There are aisles, shopping carts, packaged food, fresh produce, and recognizable brands. So at first, everything seems normal. Then the small differences start appearing. The way products are displayed, the size of certain packages, the emphasis on fresh food, the way prices are shown, the absence of some American-style promotions. And then there's something Americans often notice very quickly. The price you see is generally the price you're expected to pay. There isn't the same expectation that you'll discover a completely different final amount because of sales tax being added at the checkout. For an American visitor, that tiny difference can be surprisingly satisfying. You see the price. You put it in the trolley. You roughly know what you're spending. But that's only the beginning. Because once an American starts paying attention to everyday Australian shopping, another difference becomes obvious. Australians don't always treat massive choice as automatically better. American supermarkets can be enormous. Dozens of versions of the same product, different sizes, different flavors, different brands competing for your attention. Australia has plenty of choice too, but the experience can feel less overwhelming. And that reflects something bigger about the culture. Australia isn't America with different accents. The two countries developed similar-looking modern lifestyles, but they made different choices about how everyday life should feel. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the way Australians spend their free time. Because here's the second thing Americans notice. Australians actually use public spaces. An American visiting an Australian city might walk past a park and see families having lunch. Then someone is exercising. Someone else is walking a dog. There's a group sitting under a tree. A barbecue is being used. Children are playing. And nobody seems to think this is unusual. The park isn't just somewhere you pass through. It's part of everyday life. The same thing happens at beaches. For many Australians, the beach isn't necessarily a special vacation destination. It can be where you go after work, where you meet friends on the weekend, where you exercise, where you take your children, where you spend an hour because the weather is good. To an American visitor, that can feel almost strange. Because Americans certainly use parks and beaches, but in Australia, outdoor space can feel much more deeply integrated into ordinary routines. And there's another detail Americans often notice. Australians don't always seem to need a complicated reason to go outside. The weather is good? Go outside. Someone has a barbecue? Go outside. Friends are free? Go outside. It's almost as if the outdoors isn't an activity, it's simply another room of the house. And that leads to the third thing. Australians can be surprisingly casual about social interaction. An American might walk into a cafe and expect a certain level of polished customer service, friendly greeting, professional tone. Have a great day. Maybe a little conversation. But Australian interaction can feel different. The person serving you might make a joke. They might call you mate. They might speak casually. Then they'll get on with their job. There's often less performance. And an American who isn't used to that can initially wonder, are they being friendly or are they just being casual? Usually they're being friendly. The difference is that friendliness doesn't always need to look enthusiastic. Australia has a strong culture of informality. People can talk to strangers without making the interaction feel overly formal. Titles and status don't always dominate. Everyday conversations. And someone can be successful, wealthy, or highly educated and still speak in exactly the same relaxed tone as everyone else. That can be surprising to Americans because American culture often places more emphasis on achievement and individual status. In Australia, openly acting too impressed with yourself can sometimes produce the opposite reaction. People might joke about you. And that brings us to something Americans often discover the hard way. Australians love taking the seriousness out of things. You can be having a completely normal conversation, and suddenly someone makes a joke that seems wildly inappropriate for the situation. You're not sure whether they're serious. They're laughing. Now you're wondering whether you were supposed to laugh too. You were. This is where Australian humor can become a genuine culture shock. Sarcasm, teasing, and understatement are deeply woven into everyday conversation. Someone might compliment you by insulting you. They might tease a friend as a sign of affection. They might respond to a serious problem with a joke. And if you're unfamiliar with the culture, you can completely misread what's happening. An American might think, wait, did they just insult me? The Australian might think, obviously I'm joking. The important thing is that the joke often isn't meant to create distance. It can actually do the opposite. It creates familiarity. The more comfortable Australians are with you, the more likely they may be to tease you. So if an Australian starts making fun of you, it doesn't automatically mean they dislike you. Sometimes it means you've been accepted. But there is one habit that takes this casual attitude even further. And this is where many Americans begin to realize just how different the Australian approach to everyday life can be. Australians often don't treat minor problems like emergencies. A plan changes? No worries. It starts raining? Ah, well. Something doesn't go perfectly? We'll figure it out. That doesn't mean Australians don't care. It means there's often a cultural preference for not allowing every inconvenience to take control of your mood. And to an American visitor, this can be both refreshing and confusing. Because if you're used to treating every problem as something that needs immediate action, watching someone calmly shrug and continue with their day can almost look irresponsible. But sometimes the Australian isn't ignoring the problem. They're simply refusing to make the problem bigger than it needs to be. And once you notice that attitude, you start seeing it everywhere. At work, in conversations, at the beach, in traffic, with friends. Even when plans don't go exactly as expected. And we're only halfway through the list. Because the next few things reveal something even deeper about Australian culture. How Australians think about time, work, personal space, and even what it means to have a good life. And one of those differences is something many Americans don't fully understand until they've actually spent time living there. The next thing Americans often notice in Australia is something that doesn't appear on any tourist checklist. Australians seem to protect their personal time differently. You can see it in the workplace. Someone finishes work and actually leaves. They don't necessarily stay late just to prove they're committed. They don't always feel the need to make work the center of their identity. And for an American visitor who comes from a culture where long hours and constant availability can sometimes be associated with ambition, this can be surprising. An Australian might simply say, "I'm finished for today." And that's it. No dramatic explanation, no apology. No feeling that they need to justify having a life outside work. Of course, Australia has demanding jobs, long hours, and workplace stress just like anywhere else. But culturally, there is often a stronger expectation that work should fit into life rather than completely consume it. And this becomes especially obvious when the weekend arrives. Because Australians can be extremely serious about one thing, having a life outside work. A Saturday morning might mean coffee, sport, a beach trip, a barbecue, hiking, shopping at a local market, or simply sitting outside with friends. It doesn't have to be productive. And that word matters. Productive. Americans visiting Australia sometimes notice that Australians don't always feel the need to turn every free hour into an achievement. You don't have to build a business. You don't have to optimize your morning. You don't have to turn your hobby into a side hustle. Sometimes you can simply have a good day. And that leads to another difference Americans often notice. Australians can be surprisingly relaxed about status. Walk into a room and you may not immediately know who's the most successful person there. Someone could own a business. Someone could work in an office. Someone could be a tradesperson.